Hello everyone. Just a gentle reminder to hit that subscribe button if you haven't already, and please like this video and tap that bell. By doing so, you'll never miss a thing. And with that, welcome to the Darkest Hour. I'm your host, Amanda Jane. Some doors should never be opened, but that doesn't stop us from trying. A flickering candle, a question whispered in the dark, a planchette gliding across a board. Sometimes we go looking for answers we were never meant to find, and other times we don't have to look at all because something is already waiting. It doesn't matter if you're huddled in an abandoned building, deep in the woods, or safe in your childhood bedroom. The unknown has a way of finding us, slipping between the cracks, answering questions we never asked. And if we're not careful, we might not like what it has to say. Tonight, we step into the stories of Ouija boards that didn't just answer, but invited something in, of shadows in the trees that seemed to watch, and unseen hands reaching out from the dark. Because once a door is opened, whether in a room, in the woods, or in the mind, it may never truly close. So, let's get started, shall we? So I've never seen a ghost, but I had an experience with a Ouija board as a teenager that still haunts me. Even now, as a skeptical atheist, I have no idea how to explain what happened that night. I was 15, having a sleepover with friends like typical teenagers. We wanted to scare ourselves, so we pulled out a Ouija board. At first, nothing exciting happened. Just random movements. We all assumed that we were shaking or just doing it by accident. But then something changed. The planchette became more deliberate. We had asked for a name, and it spelled out Ian. And then it started saying something about my mom, but none of us understood what it meant. We were dumbass kids looking for a thrill, so we pushed further. We asked Ian to prove himself. Can you move something? Can you touch one of us? Can you lift one of us up? And then I felt something, an icy chill starting at my feet, slowly crawling up my body. It wasn't just cold, it was something else, something that settled deep in my bones. I sat cross-legged, barely breathing, and too afraid to move. Two of my friends were in front of me at the Ouija board. My third friend was across the room on the bed, rolling her eyes at us. She could see all of us from where she sat. My back was against the wall with no one behind me. And then without warning, I felt a hand press firmly against my back and shove me forward. I screamed. My friend on the bed screamed louder. She'd just watched my shirt yank violently upward, like something had grabbed the fabric and pulled. I shot to my feet. My whole body was literally shaking. Okay, thank you, Ian, we're done. I stammered. I pushed the planchette to goodbye, and I refused to touch the board again after that. That night, as I laid in bed, I felt that same ice-cold sensation wash over me. I pulled the blankets up to my chin, grateful that I could move, but I could see the covers rising, slowly, as if something underneath them was lifting them up. I squeezed my eyes shut, told myself that I was imagining things, but the chill stayed, the unnatural kind of cold that I couldn't shake. Finally, I had enough. I got up, sat in front of the Ouija board, alone this time, not touching it, and whispering, "Please stop." The cold faded, but I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I still felt off. My back burned where I'd felt the hand. When I looked in the mirror, my stomach dropped. There were 3 distinct red marks across my skin, like fingerprints, and they stayed there for days. I asked my mom to pick me up first thing in the morning. On the way home, I couldn't stop thinking about what had happened, so I blurted out, "Have you ever had anything paranormal happen to you?" She didn't even hesitate. "Well," she said, "there was Ian." I froze. She told me about her high school boyfriend, Ian, who had died in a car accident. After his death, people kept seeing her at his grave, even when she was nowhere near it. Her mom and sister once walked right up to a girl that they swore was her, but the second they got close, she disappeared. I have no way to explain what happened that night. I don't know what was reaching out to me or why, but I do know one thing: stay the hell away from Ouija boards. When I was in high school, my parents worked shifts at the hospital, so I was often home alone at night with my dog. On this particular night, it was around 10 p.m. My dad had already left and my mom was about to head out, leaving me alone for a few hours until he got home. As she was leaving, she pointed to a small pile of t-shirts near the stairs. My dog liked to lay on them, and she said, "Make sure you put these in the laundry hamper." The hamper was in their bedroom upstairs, so I bent down, scooped up the pile, and casually tossed it up the stairs. I didn't aim carefully, just threw it so they would land in the hallway, planning to grab it when I went to bed. My mom said goodbye, gave the dog a few pats, and then left. I called my dog to come upstairs with me, and we walked up together. But when I got to the top of the stairs, the laundry was gone. I checked my room first. Nothing. Hallway, nothing. Finally, I walked into my parents' room, and there it was, the pile of t-shirts, sitting neatly in the middle of the carpet. And trust me when I say, the layout of the house made that impossible. I hadn't thrown it anywhere near their bedroom. It should have landed right outside my door. Even if it had bounced weirdly, there was no way that it could have made it that far, at that angle, without someone physically moving it. Goosebumps crawled up my arms. My dog stood beside me, ears perked, staring at the pile. I hesitated before picking up the clothes, suddenly uneasy. And then I saw something. Underneath the pile, right where it had landed, was a small burn mark on the carpet, slightly larger than a quarter, darkened and sunken in, like something hot had rested there for quite some time. There was no smell, no smoke, just that perfect scorched imprint. I stood there for a moment, heart pounding. I'd been in this room every day. I would have noticed this mark before. I didn't really know what to do, so I just grabbed the laundry, tossed it in the hamper, and got ready for bed as fast as I could. I tried to sleep, tried to push it out of my mind, but I still think about it all the time, and I still don't have an explanation. I was never one to believe in ghosts, let alone Ouija boards. But when you're 17 at a friend's house in the middle of nowhere, and someone pulls out the board, you just play along. It was me, my best friend Jess, her cousin Nate, and his girlfriend Emily. We were in Jess's basement, the kind that was never finished. Concrete floors, exposed beams, old furniture covered in sheets. We lit a couple candles for the vibe, of course, and we put our hands on the planchette. At first, it was the usual nonsense. Is anyone here? Slow, shaky, yes. What's your name? Gibberish. We all accused each other of moving it, laughing every time it spelled something dumb. But then Nate, being the skeptic he was, rolled his eyes and asked something different. Tell us something only one of us would know. The planchette didn't move for a long time, and just as Emily was going to call it quits, it slid. It took its sweet time, but eventually we could see that it had spelled, "Sorry about the clock." Jess went pale. She pulled her hands away. Nope, I'm done. We all asked what that meant, but she refused to answer. We tried to keep going, but she wouldn't put her hand back on the board, so we said goodbye and packed it up. Later that night, after we were all camped out in the living room, Jess finally told us. Her grandfather had passed away earlier that year. The last time she saw him, he'd been fixing an old clock for her, one that hadn't worked for decades. He was halfway through the repairs when he had a stroke and passed away 2 days later. She still had the clock, untouched, sitting in the basement. I wish that was the end of it, but around 3 a.m., I woke up to this quiet, ticking, slow, rhythmic sound. I figured everyone had left their phone alarms on, but when I sat up, I realized it was coming from the basement. I was not about to investigate alone, so I shook Jess awake. She was groggy and annoyed, but when I told her to just listen, her expression changed. We woke up Nate and Emily. None of us wanted to go down there, but we also couldn't just ignore it. So with our phone flashlights cutting through the dark, we made our way to the basement floor. The moment Jess pulled it open, the ticking stopped. We stood there, silent, and then Jess muttered, "It's coming from the workbench." We inched forward, and sure enough, the clock, her grandfather's unfinished project, was sitting there, and the second hand was moving. The thing was working. None of us knew what to say. Jess walked up to it, hesitated, and then reached out and picked it up. She turned it over in her hands, eyes wide, and whispered, "It's not wound." The thing had no batteries, no working mechanism. It had been broken for years, and yet it had ticked. I don't think it was evil. I don't think it was even trying to scare us. But I do think it was real. And I'll never touch a Ouija board again, because sometimes the dead are still listening. And sometimes it might not be somebody's grandpa. I guess in this case, we just got lucky. My stepdad told me this story about accidentally smoking someone's ashes when he was in high school. He told me for about a week he would have fucked up visions of an old man who'd stand at the end of his bed glaring down at him. The friend he smoked the ashes with had the exact same scary visions too, of the scary old man in his room, but the friend recognized the haunting figure as his grandfather. It was his remains that they had smoked, and it didn't seem like he appreciated it at all, because my dad and my dad's friend shared equally hellish weeks in their own way that they attributed to the haunting. The home my dad was living in became infested with little tiny gnat bugs. His buddy's house smelled like death. He couldn't leave the house without his clothes absolutely reeking of it. His gym clothes smelled better, so he'd change in the locker room right when he'd get to school. My dad, on the other hand, had to twirl around and shake it out of his hair every time he left the house, just to get the tiny bugs off. And even after all his efforts, they still managed to get into his car, and they'd fly around as he drove. Simultaneously, my dad's skin became incredibly itchy. He developed rashes all over his body. He didn't stop scratching them, and he still has scars from the damage that he inflicted on himself. While he's scratching his skin off, his friend started losing clumps of his hair. He had long, shaggy, blonde surfer guy hair. And by the end of the week, It looked like he'd gone through chemotherapy. It eventually grew back, but it took years to get it to where it was. It wasn't until the next weekend when they could get together again, trade stories, and agree to go apologize to the urn. All of this was his friend's fault. The nasty bastard stashed his bag of weed in his grandpa's urn, trying to hide it. The baggie was opened. The weed had fallen into the ashes. Weed was hard to come by back then, so not wanting to waste a single nug, he fingered through the ashes and picked out the nugs. Without even blowing on them, he tossed them into a Ziploc. The nugs were caked in ashes, but it looked all the same, grinded up, stuffed in a doobie. His friend didn't bother telling him what had happened until after their horrendous week had ended and they could hang out again. I don't know. I think it's all pretty nasty, and I would never talk to this dude again. But that bonkersness somehow didn't affect their friendship. They're friends to this day. Like, I even know this guy. His name's Cooper. I didn't know this story about him, and I might start looking at him differently after this, but all around, he's a decent guy. I graduated from college in '03 and took a job on the East Coast. It was a 12-hour drive to my new apartment, and I had to make it alone. To avoid the heaviest traffic, I left at 6 p.m., planning to drive through the night. The first half of the trip was normal enough, and then I stopped for gas sometime after midnight. It was a 24-hour station, so I decided I could get some snacks, and I ended up talking to the cashier. He said that I could save an hour if I took a back road to the next city. I was so tired already that an hour sounded like an eternity. I wanted that shortcut. The guy said that it was a straight shot through the woods, so that's what I did. I was on the road for maybe 15 or 20 minutes when something the size of a moose ran across the road. But we don't have moose down here, and its fur was pitch black, so it definitely wasn't that. It shot right in front of me so fast that I didn't even hit the brakes. It disappeared back into the woods as quickly as it had appeared, and I just kept driving. I turned off the radio and kept replaying the event in my head. For the next few minutes, there was only the sound of my engine, but then something howled so loudly, it sounded like it was in the car with me. We had lots of wolves and coyotes where I come from, and these didn't sound like coyotes. It was closer to a wolf, but they usually howl in groups. I'm not sure that I've ever heard just one wolf howling by itself. I was going 50 miles an hour, but it didn't sound like I was moving away from the noise. When I looked out my driver's side window, the trees shook as if something large was moving through them to keep pace with me. When I slowed down, so did the movement. I wasn't about to stop, so I sped up, hoping to outrun it. I was pushing 65 when a black blur shot across the road. I'm not even sure if I hit it. Everything was just a blur. I slammed on the brakes and swerved away. Then there was a flash of trees, and the car was upside down. I was still strapped into my seat, and a small corner of the road was visible through the windshield. The huge black animal was standing just outside. I could see its back paws, like a wolf. But wolves don't get that big. It sounded like it was scratching the underside of the car. There were these awful screeching, like the metal was being ripped open. I tried to reach for the belt buckle, but I couldn't lift my arm. I couldn't feel anything. I thought I was paralyzed. My vision turned red on one side, and I realized blood was running into my eye. And then the car started rocking, like the thing was trying to shake it open. That's the last thing I remember. I drifted in and out of consciousness through my rescue. I mostly remember lights, voices, and lots of pain as they pulled me from the wreckage. I had to be airlifted to a trauma center, and that's where I lived for the next 3 weeks. I was lucky that it was a cop who found me. She drove by and found me shortly after I lost consciousness. The doctor said that I would be dead if it had taken longer than a few minutes. The officer came to visit me once I was in my recovery. She started asking me questions like if I'd seen anything unusual before the crash. I decided not to tell anyone what I saw because I knew how crazy it sounded, but I had to know if she saw it too. She'd seen something all right, but she didn't know what it was either. The thing ran off as soon as she started her siren. It definitely freaked her out as much as it had me. We both agreed to leave that part out of the story for her report. Instead, she wrote that I swerved to miss a deer. You know that one cousin your mama never let you hang out with as a kid? Never let you go to their house, and they were never allowed to spend the night at yours no matter how much you begged? Yeah, there was probably a good reason for them making that judgment call. I've got 2 stories that are perfect examples of this. They're both pretty bad, but when I heard the second story, I was so happy my mom made me go home that day. Because if I would have been there with them, I don't think that I would be the person I am today. I know my cousin ain't ever been the same since. Her name is Serenity, but family calls her Ren because 4 syllables is way too many for a first name, and her mom should have known better, thought about that before naming her that. The first of many bad judgment calls as a parent for her. Ren was free to walk the streets since she was able to walk. This bitch was in diapers at the mini-mart buying chips with money she'd stolen out of her mom's purse. This first story, we were 7 or 8 at a family barbecue. We're at my uncle's house. He lives in the mountains, and on his property he has a big tire swing made from an old tractor tire. Me and a few of the other cousins were swinging on it, pretending we were the Power Rangers. It had been a carefree day before Ren showed up. When we saw her walking up the hill towards us, the smirk that she had on her face was sinister. It was her signature devilish look that we'd come to recognize when Ren would pull one over on somebody, successfully stolen something, or had a devious plan that she wanted us to take part in. Usually, it involved swindling or stealing. This time, it was all 3 things. Down the hill, our collective families had been partying since noon. All of the kids were going to be sleeping in sleeping bags in my uncle's living room that night. We'd planned on watching movies, trading Pokemon on our Game Boys, but that never happened. Plans changed for 4 out of the 5 cousins when Ren presented the keys to her mom's minivan. She tells everyone the new plan is to sneak out, go for a joyride when the parents pass out. I'm the only cousin with enough brain cells to know that this is a bad idea. I said no before she even had the keys out of her pocket, but my other cousins aren't as bright as me. They went along with Ren's plan that night. I stayed in my sleeping bag, and I heard them giggling and whispering as they snuck out. A few minutes later, the minivan is in motion, and within moments of the engine turning on, Ren manages to immediately send the van over a hill in reverse with all of them inside. It made 3 barrel rolls and broke one of our cousins' legs. It injured everyone. All of them were in tears, and the broken leg was the worst of it, though. It took forever for the ambulance to get to the property. The leg looked like, well, it looked pretty fucked up. I remember the shin was bent all crazy. That night solidified me as the family's favorite cousin and number 1 on all of the relatives' wills without a doubt. The second story had by far worse consequences. I'm pretty sure that we were 14. It was Ren's birthday, and I was not allowed to stay for the sleepover. So my mom had picked me up. At around midnight, our house phone rings, and I hear my mom pick it up from her bedroom. It's my auntie calling from the emergency room, saying that Ren is in a coma. I'd get the first-hand story of what happened 3 days later, when Ren woke up. The plan that night was for them to sneak out, take a bus to the east side of Cleveland, and go ghost hunting in one of the abandoned buildings that Ren had been obsessing over for months. She talked about it every chance she got, swearing she'd seen something move in the broken-out windows whenever she rode past. Her parents, for whatever reason, actually agreed to let her do it, as long as she wasn't alone. So it was Ren and 3 other girls, a VHS camcorder, and an old Ouija board that someone's older brother had stolen from a garage sale. I guess the place inside was worse than they expected. No signs and no indication of what it used to be, just a rotting husk of a building, all graffitied and broken glass. They didn't get more than a few minutes of footage before the camcorder battery died, which they thought was weird because it had been fully charged when they left. But Ren was determined. If she couldn't film anything, then she'd just have to get their proof another way. They found an office tucked away in one of the back halls. The desk was still there, warped and peeling, but sturdy enough to set a board down. And that's when things got strange. The planchette started moving almost immediately. At first they thought that it was just someone messing around, but then it picked up speed. A name spelled itself out. Dante. That's what they said, anyway. Ren was the one controlling the session, the only one who seemed excited when the board started answering random questions. The others got nervous fast. They kept hearing something in the building, a sound like metal dragging against concrete, slow and steady but never stopping. But every time they shined the flashlight down the hall, there was nothing there. Then the board spelled out another message. Help me, here forever. That was enough for one of the girls. She let go and backed away. Eventually the others followed, but Ren stayed. They told me that she just sat there, staring at the board like she was waiting for it to say more. Then out of nowhere, she slumped forward. She didn't collapse, didn't seize up, just folded over the desk, her hands limp at her sides, like someone had flipped a switch and shut her off. At first they thought that she was playing around, but when she didn't respond, didn't even flinch when they shook her, they panicked. She was breathing, warm to the touch, but completely unresponsive. They had to run 3 blocks before they found a payphone to call for help. The paramedics couldn't explain it. She had no head trauma, no drugs or alcohol in her system, nothing that should have put her in a coma. She stayed like that, though, for 3 days. When she woke up, she said she didn't remember anything. Not the board, not the name it spelled out, not what happened before she passed out, but I don't think that's true. Because after she came home, she stopped talking about ghosts. She stopped sneaking out, stopped trying to convince everyone that she wasn't scared of anything. And sometimes, when she thought no one was looking, I'd catch her staring off into nothing, her eyes locked on a shadow that wasn't there. If I further pressed her about it, she would shake her head and tell me never mind or that it was nothing. But I could tell. She still heard or saw whatever it was, and whatever it was, it didn't appear to be done with her. Ren was sort of in this odd, catatonic state for years. She has since, I guess, moved on, but she really doesn't like talking about this. Almost tries to pretend it didn't happen. And if you ever bring up a Ouija board, well, she really gets upset. Definitely doesn't want to be in the presence of one. So yeah, something happened that night, and I'm just glad I wasn't there. My earliest odd experience that I consider paranormal was from my childhood home. I must have been between 3 or 6. It was something that I had never really questioned at the time. My dad would often pet my back to help me fall asleep, his big warm hand resting on my upper back. It was comforting, familiar. One night, I woke up in the middle of the night to that same feeling, his hand on my back, warm at first, moving slowly. I was groggy, half asleep, but something felt off. The pressure was a little too firm. not quite right. I tried to shake it off, not really wanting to be petted, just wanting to go back to sleep. And that's when the hand changed. The soft, steady touch, it turned frantic, grappling, poking, pressing too hard. It felt angry. My body went stiff. My breath was in my throat, and suddenly I was wide awake. My mind was scrambling for an explanation as I sat up in bed, expecting to see my dad standing there. But there was no one. Without a second thought, I climbed out of bed, ran straight to my parents' room, and squeezed them for the rest of the night. A lot of odd things happened in that house, to all of us, my parents, my siblings. Over the years, it became something that we just lived with. Eventually, I moved into my parents' old bedroom after they renovated and expanded it, merging it with my childhood room. But even then, that space never felt right. I remember one night as a teenager, home alone, lying awake while things kept happening. Small noises, shifting shadows, that creeping sense of being watched. I couldn't take it anymore. I got up in the dark, stood at the threshold of my parents' old bedroom, and just yelled into the emptiness. I told whatever it was to cut this shit out, to let me sleep in peace, to leave me the hell alone. And you know what? It did. The air in the house felt different, lighter, quieter even. Maybe I just got older and stopped noticing things, but I made peace with whatever it was. But from that night on, I wasn't really afraid of the house anymore. Now I get it. Brains are weird, memories are fickle, especially childhood ones. And at 42, I know that every time we access a memory, we change it a little. But I also know what I felt, and no one is going to tell me otherwise. Well, friends, it appears we've reached the end of tonight's episode. Thanks for joining me. Whether it's your first time or you're a regular, your support means the world over here. We've got brand new episodes every Friday night, and keep those eyes open for those deep sleep videos. And of course, subscribe, tap the bell, and you'll never miss a thing. Special thanks to the Darkest Hour channel members: Lori TESDAHL, Sarah Marie, Robert Bailey, T COLTDADDY Eagle, Mallory Dominguez, KARI Watkins, PILAR Geo, TREDEN WIXSON, Larry Hill, and Ripley. Big thanks to those who shared their stories, and a huge shout out to all of our patrons: Tracy S, Mary H, Tanya F, Tamara K, Monica L, ZoeWatt, Chelle B, Donald C, Marion T, Rat Girl, Alisha S, Erin G, Nikki H, Mr. Revenant, Naz K, Brendon G, Paul T, Nicholas C, Tony P, Lissane, Arlene F, Adrian, TF Parham, Jason G, and Lori T. If you want to support the Darkest Hour in other ways, consider joining our Patreon. Check out patreon.com/thedarkesthour or click the link in the description to learn more. Do you have stories like these? I'd love to share them. Send them to me, Amanda, darkesthour@gmail.com, or on the Darkest Hour subreddit, The Darkest Hour YT. Stay spooky.